So what I like to do is to transition now from our understanding of history and then the application into the 20th and 21st century. And this is a very important part of history and theology, that we translate what we've learned in our historical theological context, but then we say, well, what does it mean for us today? So I want to pick up on the three problems that Vince has identified for us and talk about the assumption of normality, the unequal distribution of power, and colorblindness. And then we're going to open it up for questions for us to dialogue about this. But first I want to talk about what is cultural competency. And Vince alluded to this towards the end of his time there, where he was talking about cultural competency for me is the understanding of one's own culture and the assertion of that culture into the larger dialogue so that who you are is engaged in that dialogue. Cultural incompetency is not knowing your cultural context and then trying to come into this conversation without any sense not only of the other's position, but your own position, where you're coming from. So this is where some of the problems arise when it comes to the relationship between church and culture. Part of our failings in cultural competency is that we don't understand the relationship between church and culture, or we assume that there are certain ways of doing things that we don't realize, wait, that's not necessarily a biblical thing, that might be more of a cultural thing. This is an illustration that was given by Andrew Walls, who's a missiologist who teaches Wales? Edinburgh. And Walls' missiology talks about how we understand the gospel. Now, he uses this paradigm, or he uses this illustration, talking about a movie theater experience. I'm sorry, a theater experience, a play experience, and you're in this theater, and where you sit determines how you understand what's going on that stage. Now, I'm not a theater buff, so I went with something that I know more of, which is baseball. So if you like baseball, a few years ago when I was living in Boston, they would give away this clergy pass for all members of the Boston clergy. Anybody live in Boston? You have one of those too? Isn't it the best deal in the entire world? So they did that for years, and then that's why we won the World Series a few years back. It was the prayers of the clergy who went to the games and prayed. When I moved to Chicago, I wrote away to the Cubs, and they have yet to respond to my letter. And we know how many years have they been losing, so, you know, prayers. And then afterwards, after they won, they cut the program off. Did you know that? And then they lost the next year, and then they reinstated the program, and then they won the following year. So I'm just saying. So now one of the cool things about having this clergy pass is that you got to kind of stand and sit anywhere you want. And now the Fenway's sold out every time, so you just kind of move around the stadium and see the game from different angles. Now, if you go to a stadium, you know that you're kind of obligated to sit in one seat, but if you ever get a chance to move around, you know that you see different things. So if you're sitting behind home plate, you can see the balls and strikes pretty clearly. You can see the angle of the catcher, and you can hear even the umpire saying stuff. But then you can't really see the fly balls to the outfield because you're too far away or you're under the overhang. Then you move out to right field to try to check that out, but then now you can see the trajectory of the fly balls, but what can't you see? Balls and strikes. They're kind of far away. Then you move to the third base line, and you can see all the infield chatter and what's going on in the dugout. But now you can't see what's going on in right field, and first base is a little too far away. So wherever you're seated in your stadium determines what you're going to see in the game. In some places you're going to see the foul ball more clearly. In some places you're going to see the balls and strikes more clearly. But not everybody is going to get the best view on every single play because you are seated in different parts of the stadium. Now, Walls takes this and say, this is how we need to understand contextualization and the gospel message. Because what is going on the field? Is it 50,000 different games on the field? No, it is one game. Everybody's watching the exact same game, but different people have different angles on the game. So how do you know if you've got all the information about the game? By talking to one another. It's like if you're watching the game on TV, what do? Do you want one stationary camera behind home plate? No, if you're watching the World Series right now, or I'm sorry, the League Championship Series and soon to be World Series, but if you're watching those games, how many angles do they have? It seems like they have cameras on every seat in the stadium. Why? Because it's important to get the different angles of the stadium, otherwise you miss something. And if you sometimes watch the instant replay, you realize from one angle it looks like a foul ball, from another angle you realize that it was a fair ball. And that's why it's important to get the different angles on the game. Now again, the game is the same wherever you sit in the stadium. It's the same truth. It's the gospel message. It's the great drama of the Christian story. And it's the same for everybody. But depending on where you sit in the stadium, you're going to get a slightly different angle. The problem is, if that person with season tickets behind a third base line says, this is the only way to see the game. I don't care what that person in right field has to say to me. This is the only way for me to understand the game. This is the absolute definitive way of seeing how the game is played out. Now, what is that? That's what I call cultural captivity. When you assume that your seat in the stadium is the only authoritative way to understand what's going on in the gospel story. When actually you've got to hear, if you're seated in one particular location, you've got to hear, well, what did the Christians in the early African church understand about that? Because I need to hear that angle, because I missed that particular part of Christology that they got because they're coming from a cultural context that sees the game from a slightly different angle. So are you with me on this relationship between the church and the culture, and how the dialogue that we have historically, theologically, cross-culturally, internationally is a critical part of getting the fuller understanding of what is the gospel message. Let's go to the next slide. And I don't want to go into this too much, but Walls talks about the indigenizing principle and the pilgrim principle. And that when the church encounters culture, or vice versa, there are things in the culture that the church needs to go in and say, that's not quite right. There are things you've got to change. And that's what we call I got that backwards, the pilgrim principle. The other is, you know what? There's something in that culture that's okay. We can redeem that. We can bring it into the church and make it a part of our culture, make it a part of our Christian culture. So I'll give you two different examples on this. A negative example of this would be like widow burnings. Now we're saying, no, you know what? The gospel cannot deal with that. That's not right. There's just something wrong about widow burnings, and the gospel has a pilgrim position on that and says, no, we need to take a stand as the gospel of Jesus Christ needs to stand against something like widow burnings. Or you can go up here and say, you know, I've seen some dancing and expression in the native community. And that's not anything that I'm used to, and it feels very culturally specific, but I'm not going to look at that and say, well, that's a pagan evil ritual, because that's a indigenizing principle. There is an indigenous expression of Native American dance that can be adapted or adjusted or approached in a way that can convey the gospel message in the same way that many of us lift our hands in worship, or we use drums, and to say that the Native Americans can't dance or use native drums, that doesn't make any sense, because you are indigenizing within that cultural context. So you see that difference. So if we go to the next slide, what we'll see is that oftentimes you have these two areas, but then there's that kind of area that oftentimes can overlap. And that's where it gets a little tricky. The principle that I would suggest when we talk about this, and this is when you start doing cross-cultural ministry, sometimes this is pretty clear. You can clearly say, you know what, we're not going to burn widows this year at our church. We're just not going to do it. Well, that's because it's a pilgrim principles, and we know that. Or we want to have this expression of native dance because we have natives in our church who want to express that as a part of their culture. That's an indigenizing principle. But then you get a little bit of that gray area. And that's when you get a little bit of the cultural clash. And I don't think there's any kind of definitive way to answer that question. I would suggest something that theologian Stephen Bevins, former missionary to the Philippines, has written a concept called transcendentalism. And in that, and it's not TM or anything like that. In the transcendental approach, he's saying let the indigenous culture decide. Let them decide. Don't come and say, I'm sorry, that's right, that's wrong, that's right, that's wrong. Let the culture within that community decide and say, you know what, you might be uncomfortable with the idea that we bring food to the gravesite, but at the same time, we're not worshiping our ancestors, we're offering food. And it's just like you bringing flowers to your gravesite. So don't say that we're worshiping other gods or our ancestors. Allow us, and this is an example taken out of the Korean community, allow us to make that determination of what is the pilgrim and the indigenizing. And that's a kind of a way we can deal with some of the cultural differences when in that gray area.